Hello, I'm Bridget Byrne, Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, CODE. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this third event of the 4-day conference that's organised in partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Runnymede Trust on racial inequality in a time of crisis. For those who haven't been at the other sessions, I wanted to tell you a little bit about CODE. The Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity is a research centre based at the University of Manchester, but bringing together colleagues from 10 universities across the UK. Our current research programme, looking at COVID, race and ethnic inequalities, seeks to provide a rapid response to the crisis posed by COVID-19 and its social and cultural and economic impact on racial and ethnic minorities. We're a multidisciplinary team using a range of different methods and seeking to provide robust evidence on the often lethal impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and inequality. We aim to provide new data in accessible formats to champion policy and institutional change by showing where and how racial inequality is present, how it builds on and extends existing patterns of inequality, and how this is experienced in everyday lives. We've launched what we hope will be the largest survey of its kind of ethnic, racial and religious minorities and how they've been impacted by the pandemic. The survey is called EVENS, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, and I'd encourage you to fill it in. There'll be more information at the end of the seminar. We're really clear that the impact of racial and ethnic discrimination and disadvantage are not one-off events, but processes that happen across the life course and across all aspects of the lives of individuals and communities. We want to understand these processes, but also working with a range of partners, we want to think about how communities are challenging discrimination and disadvantage, particularly in the wake of Black Lives Matter. We're really pleased to have this partnership with the Stuart Hall Foundation. We take on Stuart Hall's call for the aim of academic research on race and racism to be to change the world by challenging racial injustice and discrimination. We also collaborated with the Stuart Hall Foundation and the Holick Family Foundation on the Stuart Hall Race Report, which summarises the policy recommendations that have been present over the last 40 years of tackling racial inequality in Britain. We know the problems, it's time for a change. So I'm very pleased that today's session is focused on employment and young people. I would hope that there's been a change in the public's understanding of what jobs matter and who's doing those jobs. As the posters went up in the support of the NHS and other key workers, the knowledge that those fulfilling the most crucial jobs in our society are often the most poorly paid has hopefully hit home. There's a new respect and gratitude for shopkeepers, nurses and taxi drivers who carried on working despite the risks. These jobs, we know, are disproportionately done by people from racialised backgrounds, and this is part of the explanation for their vulnerability to the virus, alongside factors such as housing, insecure employment, and other forms of deprivation, which increased risk and also place a strain on health. But the pandemic has also produced a crisis in employment which hits many of the sectors where ethnic minority people work, clustered in those occupations through long processes of racism and discrimination. The employment crisis is also particularly impacting on young people, and that's why this panel is so important. I hope you find it informative, and please follow CODE's work on Twitter, Instagram, and the web. You can also find links to the recordings of the past events of this week on policing and health and well-being on the Stuart Hall Foundation's website. And consider attending the last of this conference tomorrow on culture and cultural activism. Now I want to hand over to Ken Clark, who's going to introduce and chair the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Hello, everyone, and welcome. So my main job tonight is really just to introduce the speakers and then to chair the subsequent discussion. But before I do that, I wanted to set the scene a little bit by sharing some thoughts and some of the research that's currently going on at CODE, where I work, along with Bridget and some others. So I hope you can see my slides. I've been working in this area for a number of years now, 30 years, I think. It's interesting to look back over that period and to think what's changed, what hasn't changed. There's a very strong sense in which the issues that we're talking about are a long-standing problem. And when a colleague, Will Shankly, and I were writing about this last year, this was how we summarised our chapter on this topic. We said, this chapter has documented well-established persistent patterns in the labour market disadvantage of ethnic minorities in the UK. These patterns have been studied extensively over several decades, are well known in policy-making circles, and indeed have been the focus of a variety of initiatives by local and central government. In the face of this attention, it is the persistence of the broad patterns and trends that's the most striking feature of the snapshot of the current data presented here. So I think the very fact that we're sitting here tonight and having this event suggests that in some ways these issues are still very live issues and things haven't changed. But we did go on in the next paragraph, in fact, to note that, in fact, well, there have been some changes. So some things have actually changed. And in particular, you know, we can see some closure of gaps in employment rates between ethnic minority groups, especially when we don't look at students. We can see some limited change in pay gaps. And then I've put a chart up here, which is unemployment rates, white people in the red and ethnic minorities in the blue over quite a long period of time, back to 2001. And you can see that this very large 7 or 8 point gap here in the unemployment rates has declined to something closer to a 2 percentage point gap just as we go into the pandemic. So there has been some change. There has been some evidence of an improvement in relative performance in the labour market between different groups. But some current work that we're doing suggests that, well, maybe this is reflective of something else, and maybe this is reflective of what I've called here a displacement of disadvantage. And some of the work I'm currently doing with Nico Ochman in the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity is trying to look at that issue, and it's trying to look at the issue of labour market insecurity, about precarity, about a lack of attachment to the labour market. And what this diagram here is trying to do is just to suggest that maybe that decline in unemployment has been matched by an increase in other forms of insecure work or not particularly good quality jobs in the UK labour market. So very briefly, I mean, in this slide, we've got various different types of employment which might be described as less than secure or precarious or exhibiting not a strong attachment to the labour market. So as well as unemployment in this kind of orange, we've got part-time work, which is involuntary. We've got low-paid work. We've got solo self-employment, which solo self-employment can be a good thing for people, but in fact, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of the solo self-employment that's around in the UK labour market is not a good job and is actually quite precarious, very poorly paid, offers very low job satisfaction. And then we've got temporary jobs, and zero-hour contracts are included in there as well. And what I think you can see in this is that, yes, indeed, these orange unemployment bars have shifted over time. So we've got 93 to 2007 there. We've got 2008 to 2022, 2 different periods here. Over time, those orange bars have indeed declined. But the overall length of these bars, which shows the proportion of each group that's in some form of precarious or insecure employment, those haven't changed at all. So in fact, the unemployment, in a sense, has been replaced by another form of less than ideal labour market attachment. So that's some of the work that we're currently looking at in code, and in some sense helps to set the scene for tonight's conversation. The final thing I'd say is just trying to bring this up to date and thinking about where we are now. We're in a situation where we've got a very deep economic recession. The full labour market impact of that, I don't think we've seen that yet, and we know it's going to come. We know it's going to be bad, and that's likely to affect young ethnic minority people particularly badly. And so I've just put up there a link to, or a picture of a blog that my colleague Steve Nolan and I wrote in the Conversation website, which looks at that, and which is essentially making the point that we've got this evidence base from the past and from past recessions, which suggests that we know what's going to happen here. We know that some groups are going to be disadvantaged by this more than others. And we're kind of posing the question, are policymakers aware enough, smart enough to try and do something to ameliorate some of these kind of disadvantages which are likely to result from the pandemic and the subsequent recession. So that's a very brief kind of overview of some of the work that we're doing in Code. And as I said, my intention there is to attempt to set the scene for the subsequent presentations that we're going to hear and the discussion that will come after. What I'd like to do now then is, if I could just ask our speakers to come on screen, and I will very briefly introduce them to you. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Our speakers tonight, we're very lucky to have them. We've got Dr. Andrea Barry, who's a senior analyst at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She works there in their work outcome group, and is involved in providing and disseminating evidence related to the JRF's agenda on poverty. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Omar Khan, who is the director of TASO, which is the Centre for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. Omar is a former director of the Runnymede Trust. And our third speaker is Sandra Kerr, OBE, who's the race director for Business in the Community, which is a business-led network of organisations from private and public sector, which is committed to race equality as part of good business practice. So those are our three speakers. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Omar and Sandra to disappear for a short while. And we're going to hear from Andrea, who also, I believe, is going to show us some slides. So thanks, Andrea. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting not only me, but the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to the event. This is actually quite exciting. Let me just get my presentation up. And please, I'm assuming everyone can see that properly. Yes, I'll keep going.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So as it says on the screen, I'm Andrea. I'm a senior analyst at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I do a lot of the work on work, and particularly recently, I wrote the work chapter for our UK poverty report and also chaired our session webinar on ethnicity and poverty. So this piece of work is actually quite close to what I do almost every day, and I'm really excited to share some work on it. So at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we recognize that, especially when you think about ethnic labor market inequalities, it starts early. And so what I'm going to show is some evidence that corresponds to that early trends of this, inequality between whites and people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. And where I can in the data, I've separated it out by ethnicity to get a better picture of what's actually going on. So let me go to first, I will talk about in-work poverty as a whole. So this is in-work poverty for those who are 16 to 24, who are what we consider adults, not students or anything, who are in work, and the difference between who are an ethnic minority or who are white. And I also considered the 25 to 29s just to show what a big gap that can also be. So for ethnic minorities, you see that the in-work poverty rate is over 20%. And then once they're over 25, it drops down to just under 15%. But first, I should also say, how do we define poverty? There's many different ways to define poverty, but here we consider it as an income below 60% of the median after housing costs, because we recognize housing costs is a big factor as why people are actually in poverty. It's not just their earnings, it's also high and unaffordable housing costs, which will feature quite a bit in this discussion as well. So as we can see early on, there is a difference between how in-work poverty rates between ethnic minorities when they're young and then even when they're getting older. But why? So as Ken said earlier, it is related to sectors. So these are just the overall in-work poverty rates by sectors. We consider these are, I wouldn't say worst offenders, but some of the highest rates of in-work poverty by sector. And that white line, that line there is for all workers, just overall in-work poverty. And then you see the sectors, so wholesale and retail and accommodation and food. So wholesale and retail and accommodation and food have higher rates of in-work poverty, but also in terms of region and country, London and Wales have the highest rates of in-work poverty, and Scotland, Northern Ireland, and East Midlands have the lowest. There are stark differences of in-work poverty rates by ethnicity, with around 1 in 3 Bangladeshi and Pakistani workers in poverty. But when you break it down even further between the sectors worked, because a lot of this discussion is just about sectors, you see that the young ethnic minorities are also reflected in this overrepresentation of sectors worked by, Black and Asian minority ethnic workers as a whole, and younger workers, because, earlier, during the pandemic, the earlier part of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about the impact of COVID on young workers, as well as ethnic minorities, and they were separate. But we also argue that they should also be joint because there's that overlap of multiple aspects of the pandemic that are affecting certain people quite keenly. So while, BAME workers have a higher representation in retail, in accommodation, food, which you see here, but also transport, which has been directly impacted by the pandemic. So I'm also going to talk about underemployment. I'm really pleased that Ken introduced unemployment because I thought to myself, oh gosh, I'm not going to talk about unemployment. I'm going to talk about its cousin, underemployment. So how do we define underemployment? It's simply someone who wants to work more hours, but are unable to find the work with more hours. So it could be at their current employer. Maybe they want to take a second job to find more hours to work, but they can't find that work. So they're underemployed. So these are just the percentage of the under 25s who are underemployed Q3 in 2019. So that's before the pandemic. And as you can see, Bangladeshi and even white workers have high rates of underemployment. But if we go to during COVID, someone decided this was post-COVID, but that doesn't exist yet. If we go during COVID, you see Bangladeshi workers have had quite a rise in underemployment, whereas white workers, other Asian, Pakistani, et cetera, have not. Again, there's a discussion of why does this matter for your under 25s, and is this reflected in all ethnic minority workers? And unfortunately it is. These same graphs, when we do them for underemployment for over 25s, shows a very similar pattern of underemployment. And again, it's related to the initial point, which is these discrepancies, these differences early on in your labor market experience follow you as you continue on in your interaction with the labor market, and they follow on in increasing your probability that you will stay in poverty or experience poverty as a cycle when you're in the labor market for as long as, quite frankly, as you live. You see higher rates of pensioner poverty amongst Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals. And part of it is simply to do with a pattern of low pay throughout most of their labor market lives. I'm also going to go on and just briefly mention, I'm not going to go too deep because this is Omar's field, but I just would have decided to, for my own work, the pattern of graduate destinations 1 year after graduation, because there's been lots of reports that suggest, that look at why maybe some minority ethnic communities aren't doing as well in the labor market, and they start thinking about things like education. Are they getting higher education? Are they getting qualifications? And as you can see here, they're clearly in sustained employment or further study after they graduate. But what about their salaries? So unfortunately, the pay differences start early. Again, it starts early. So even though this is 10 years after leaving higher education, the same pattern we're seeing 1 year after leaving higher education, in 5, in 10, and that's available in the Ethnicity Stats website with the government. And you see clear differences. Let's look at Pakistani and Bangladeshi, Black African, Black Caribbean, clear pay differences between groups very early on. And again, this was seen in 1 year, 5 year, and now in 10 years after leaving higher education. Now, I just wanted to briefly talk about our needs. So not in employment, not in employment, education, or training. And you see, and this is the people who are just economically inactive. So they're not even necessarily looking for employment or training or anything. They're just completely economic inactive. And you see relatively high rates for Pakistani women in what we call NEET, as well as those who are Bangladeshi and even white. So there could be, especially amongst women, so there could be a discussion of why that is true. But for one of the only parts of that is Black. So you see Black men were more likely to be inactive than Black women who are considered neat. But finally, I'm just going to briefly talk about housing, because when we talk about ethnicity, it's so important to include a discussion of housing and affordable housing. Now, I must caveat some of this piece of work, because this is, as we like to say, new and changing. So we are starting to look at the systemic problems of racism in housing and its interaction with poverty. And what you see here is this is working adults in unaffordable accommodation by sector and ethnicity. So this isn't necessarily just for under 25s or 16 to 24s. This is for everyone. But there's another aspect of this, is understanding unaffordable housing is impacting clearly certain ethnicities more than others, and people working in certain sectors. So there's something that we call hidden households. So we have people, usually younger, 16 to 25, who are living with family members, who are living with other people because they simply can't afford to rent, or they can't afford to get essentially off their mama's couch and go off on their own, because there's just the lack of affordable housing in their area. And they're more likely as well to be working in certain sectors that just do not pay them enough or they're underemployed, who just doesn't allow them to actually get out of being in a hidden household. So just finally, I'm just going to conclude, hopefully on time. So some of these policies that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation are interested in, not only, I hate this almost sounds like a all lives matter aspect of it, but it will impact not only just young people, but also ethnic minorities. And it's just thinking about people early on. So the first line came from our spending review, or budget, paper that we just put out last week. And it's just that the government is trusting that existing schemes such as Kickstart, aimed at providing funded job placements for young people, will be sufficient enough to, support people back into work. For those who don't know, the Kickstart scheme provides funding to create new job placements for 16 or 24-year-olds on universal credit who are at risk of long-term unemployment, because long-term unemployment has a deep scarring effect on people who, as we see in other graphs, maybe that might come after me. So employers of all sizes can apply for the funding, but JRF argues that the recent budget should have extended Kickstart beyond its proposed December end date, because we don't think that the actual recovery will necessarily be done by December. We think it should be prolonged to increase the ability for people to actually get trained, get into placements, and get onto a more positive aspect of the labor market. But also, we think that there should be additional support for people who already hold qualifications but still need help. Runnymede Trust did some really good work a few years ago that showed just the pay differentials between people. And you see that graduates with a degree, people with Black men with a degree graduate has a 17% difference in pay than someone who was white in the same location, the same job, et cetera. And so that it's not just education is my point. It's more than that. So we need more support for people who are in that situation, who might face an unequal jobs market as soon as they enter it. But we also need, as I said before, low-cost housing. Low-cost housing will really impact young ethnic minorities. But also, we need the recovery to be led by the creation of good jobs. We cannot go back to higher rates of underemployment and precarious work, like Kim was just talking about, where people, mostly ethnic minorities and younger ethnic minorities, are entering that and staying stuck there. And we also need to strengthen the benefit system. They did extend the uplift to the universal credit and working tax credit until September, but we think it should be made permanent, and it should be extended to all benefits. So people who are, for example, disabled can also get on that. And that is me.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Andrea. That was very interesting. I think I was particularly struck by some of the sort of differences between individual minority groups in some of those slides, particularly around the underemployment. So perhaps that's something that we might want to pick up on in the discussion later. But thank you for now very much for that. Omar is up now, and Omar, you've got about 10 minutes. Can I just remind people, if they do have any questions, to type them into the chat box, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can later on in the session. Omar.
Great. I'm delighted to be here speaking at a code event. As director of TASO for the first time, we're a new What Works Center, looking at what works in tackling inequalities in higher education. And amongst those inequalities in HE are obviously ethnic inequalities, and those ethnic inequalities in higher education translate, as Andrea has well outlined, into inequalities in the labor market. I'm not going to actually present slides because I've seen that Ken and Andrea, I think, have outlined some of the evidence. So instead, I'm going to speak to some of the issues that we're looking at TASO to try to address HE inequalities, but also some of the explanations and policies that I think are necessary. So I think the first thing to note, which is a positive, I think we should note that there are very high levels of higher education participation amongst Black and minority ethnic people in the UK. And those figures have been high for many years. The ethnic minority participation rates in higher education have outstripped white British rates for many decades in most cases. However, there are still significant inequalities within higher education, particularly in terms of the what is now called the BAME degree awarding gap. So that's the proportion of graduates who get a first or a 2-1. And there's very significant gaps between the proportion of those who get a first or 2-1 from Black and minority ethnic groups, especially from Black groups, and the proportion of white graduates who get a first or a 2-1. Now that's, I think, important in itself. It has means that ethnic minorities are less likely to enjoy or feel like they belong or are satisfied with their HE experience, but also significant impacts in the labor market, of course, because many employers prefer graduates with firsts or 2-1s. One of the things that we're doing at TASO to try to address this is looking at interventions in the curriculum. So we're currently looking at interventions the two different universities are engaged with, sort of around decolonizing and other activities to reform curricula. And what we're looking at is whether or not students that go on sort of reformed or decolonized curricula have a lower BAME attainment gap. So that's an attempt by us to try to provide some evidence of whether this actually works. And obviously the hypothesis is that the existing curriculum are one of the reasons why BAME students do worse, and that this may engage them further. Obviously, there are other reasons to reform curricula, and those that apply regardless of whether or not you think the attainment degree awarding gap is a problem or not. And of course, the other factor here that I won't be speaking about today, but is relevant, especially when we're talking about the labor market, is the low level of Black and minority ethnic staff in higher education, particularly at senior levels. And I think there is a sort of vicious circle here where you have fewer graduates getting those first and 2-1s, which means they're less able to get a PhD studentship funded, and so less able to become lecturers and readers and professors of the future. In addition to, I think, the role of degree awarding in explaining some of the inequalities, I think another factor that is relevant is the kinds of institutions that Black and minority ethnic people are more likely to attend. So there is while I've said that there's high levels of HE participation, the participation gaps are more significant at the Russell Group. And of course, employers are more keen to hire Russell Group graduates. But as Andrea has shown, I think it's really important, especially when talking about these inequalities, that even when you control for those kinds of inequalities that we see in HE, i.e. the fact that you're less likely to get a first or a 2-1 if you're a Black graduate compared to a white graduate, that still can't explain the levels of employment inequalities that we see in the labor market 5 and 10 years after graduation. So even once we control for the fact that people go to different institutions and get different degree qualifications or worse or more unequal degree qualifications, the inequalities we see 5 and 10 years in terms of salaries and wages, or even in terms of job satisfaction. So a recent study showed that Black graduates were more dissatisfied in their jobs 5 years after graduation, even when controlling for income, suggests that in addition to the inequalities in higher education, those inequalities in the labor market are still affecting Black and minority ethnic graduates worse than their white British counterparts. And I think one of the things I want to say there is sometimes this is framed as, well, universities can't do much more. It's about employers behaving better or trying to tackle discrimination in the labor market. My sort of response to that in terms of higher education providers is why are we talking about this in terms of either or? It should be both and. It's both the case that higher education providers, universities, FE colleges need to do better in terms of ensuring that their graduates do well in the labor market, and it's the case that employers need to do more to tackle discrimination in the labor market. And that also leads, I think, to I've been talking about higher education only, but of course, higher education is not the only route into employment. And while that is TASO's focus, obviously there are very significant questions about the current routes into employment for those who don't have graduate degrees. And Britain has a long-standing gap and a lack of investment in sort of training and skills, which has meant that those who don't have a degree are even more affected by labor market inequalities, and I think more exposed to discrimination in the labor market, therefore. And one of the things that, it is good to see that there's more focus now on investment in FE or further education, and I would hope that that will lead to better outcomes in the labor market for those who have those qualifications. But I think, as Andrea and Ken have both indicated, I think there's real concerns that one of the impacts of COVID will be those with what sort of employers consider lower or lesser qualifications will be even more likely to be in high-risk roles, whether that's in terms of being exposed to the pandemic or whether that's in terms of being in precarious jobs. So I think there's concerns that JRF actually has outlined in previous research that we're seeing a bit of a hollowing out of the middle of the labor market, and that we're seeing an increase in sort of graduate type level jobs, but we're also seeing an increase in the type of low paid, low security type jobs. And it looks like the coronavirus pandemic has, if anything, accelerated those problems. And I think, finally, I think I'll close by highlighting the issue of structural inequalities of race in British society generally, but specifically in the labor market. I think sometimes when we talk about these issues, there's a sort of tendency to say, well, it's really explained by class or qualification. I've already indicated why qualification isn't a very good explanation for labor market inequalities when it comes to racial inequalities in the labor market. Because ethnic minorities are more likely to have higher qualifications. It's also the case, worth noting, that actually people born outside of Britain are much more likely to have higher education qualifications than those born in Britain. So migration can't really explain that either. But I think the most important study here are those that show that even when you have the same qualifications, you have to send in 50 to 100% times as many CVs just to get interviewed. And I think those studies decisively show that there's discrimination in the labor market, racial discrimination in the labor market at the point of sifting. So that is at the point at which employers decide who should or shouldn't get in the door to get an interview. But I think it's worth reflecting, do we really think that the same people who are doing the sifting and the fact that there's discrimination in who gets chosen to get through the door for an interview, do we really think that once people get into the building, that discrimination ends when it comes to things like deciding on progression and promotion? So I think one of the important things about those studies, it shows not merely that there's clear evidence of racial discrimination in the labor market at selection or sifting stage, but it's very likely that the sort of that evidence will apply at other phases of decision points in people's careers, whether that's progression, promotion, or indeed things like redundancy and performance management reviews. So in terms of policies, I just want to say one final thing there as well. I very much endorse what Andrea said, especially in terms of universal credit. But I think the other thing I wanted to note from the finding on the education, while I'm committed to an organization that focuses on education, I think tackling educational inequalities by itself is unlikely to tackle these labor market inequalities. So we need to see more direct interventions on the labor market itself, more robust monitoring of racial discrimination, and more support for employees who suffer and experience racial discrimination in the labor market. And finally, I think we need more, as with Andrea's suggestion, I think a lot of the anti-poverty measures, I mean, when we look at things like child poverty and especially housing deprivation and overcrowding, the disproportionate effect on Black and minority ethnic families is so striking that an effective anti-poverty measure, an effective set of policies that dealt with housing costs would disproportionately benefit Black and minority ethnic families. And I think it would allow the parents of those children who are living in poverty. So, 59% of Bangladeshi children, 54% of Pakistani children, and 47% of Black children are living in poverty after housing costs. That puts enormous pressure on their parents in terms of putting food on the table, going out and taking whatever job they can on offer. And of course, in the current circumstances, exposing them to coronavirus. So I think there's a lot that could be done there that would tackle inequality. So I'm in favor both of policies that would address the educational inequalities that we see, which is the focus of my current role, but also in favor of policies that would address poverty generally. And finally, I think more controversial sometimes in the British context is policies that specifically target ethnic minority workers who are experiencing who still, in many decades after they first arrived in that Windrush, from Windrush in 1948, are still experiencing discrimination. And it appears that the application of anti-discrimination legislation just hasn't been robust enough in this. And maybe Sandra, who I'm going to turn to next, will say something more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. That was great. So yeah, there's a lot of food for thought in there. And I was, as someone who works in an HE institution, I was particularly struck by, I think, the challenge that some of those remarks around awarding gaps in attainment, some of the challenge that offers. So I'm going to invite Sandra to unmute herself, and here she is. Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
While Sandra's getting ready, can I just remind you, if you've got any questions, please do type them into the chat box. And if you're on Twitter, then the event is being live tweeted, I think, at the Code Twitter account, which is Ethnicity UK. And there's a hashtag, which is #COVID Inequality UK. So that's the hashtag for the live tweet of tonight's event. And if you want to contribute to that, please feel free to do so over there on Twitter. But for now, let me hand over to Sandra.
Thank you very much, Ken, and really have enjoyed hearing the presentations from Ken and Andrea and Omar. I want to focus on race and work, ethnicity and work. We work with employers from public and private sector who know that actually, if we really are going to build back better, we need to build back responsibly and build back inclusively. When we look at, so one of the things that obviously is a focus on my mind right now is what is happening with youth unemployment. In 2008, following the financial crash, we know that there was a disproportionate impact on youth unemployment with young, particularly the Black youth, as well as other ethnicity groups. I know that in 2012, that was 4 years on, 5 years, when everyone's saying, oh, we're so glad that's over. I know that youth unemployment for Black males was 55%. Part of the challenge has been, to date, trying to get data from DWP. I don't find it transparent and easy to access at all. I've actually found some information from a Commons publication, but actually that was shared with me yesterday, that shows currently Black youth unemployment is looking like 29% compared to 12% for white youth unemployment. So we can already see the indicators that this is rising. So it does need some urgent focus and attention. I want to share some things that we are working on, an insight that we're using to help to advise employers on what action to take. One of the things we did in August last year, following the killing of George Floyd, and demand from employers for more insight how to make sure they're being inclusive of their Black employees, was run the data from the Race at Work survey, which we originally conducted in 2015 again in 2018, and actually we're opening it again on the 22nd of March of this month. We ran all the data for the responses from the Black respondents from African, Caribbean, Black other background. And I'm just going to flag some key questions. One we asked was, what do you think is going to be a barrier to your next career move? 33% of Black respondents said their ethnicity compared to 1% of white respondents. So there is a perception, and we know that's often based on experience, that if your ethnicity is going to get in the way. So we are using that to amplify and reinforce advice and recommendations to employers that you have diversity on your SIFT panels, on your selection panels, to help to ensure that you are being as inclusive as possible and not discriminating. We have evidence from the employers who've already implemented this, that they say they get better results. There are more inclusive results, more people from different ethnic backgrounds get through the process. So we're encouraging that action alongside monitoring, tracking people from attraction through to SIFT, through to assessment, through to interview, through to appointment, through to hire, to check there's not a disproportionate dropout rate from any ethnicity group. The second thing that we are encouraging employers, again, based on the insight amplified in the Black Voices report, we know through historic research, mentoring is highly valued by ethnic minority people, and we've been encouraging employers to enter into two-way mentoring relationships where leaders will mentor and also be mentored by the person from the different backgrounds. But we are also now adding sponsorship to that. And that is about advocacy, that is about opening opportunities, particularly in rooms where people aren't even present to know that there is an opportunity. Because when we asked, again, when we checked the data about would you like a sponsor, 31% of Black respondents said yes, they would want one. And therefore, that is an open door. We're encouraging employers to think about when people join the organization, how they can ensure they're attaching them to somebody who can actually open those opportunities and networks, and also an understanding of how that workplace is navigated, because that's difficult when you do not have people in your networks or family members who are already working in the industry that can help with that insight. The third thing, based on the evidence from the Black Voices report, was when we asked people at work, do you believe you get credit for your work? 49% of Black respondents said yes, compared to 57% of every other ethnicity group who've completed the survey. So when you think about the challenge of getting credit for your work and that not happening, then you are not seen as the person to progress, to get the opportunity to stretch and to be promoted. And then when you think about the issues of, if you're starting at the lower rung of an organization, how do you climb that ladder if you do not get credit for your ideas, if you are not seen as the person generating them, even though you are? So we are actively encouraging leaders to be inclusive, managers to actively ensure that they are listening and that they're ensuring that the credit for work and ideas are correctly attributed so that people are able to progress in their careers. The other area that we are looking at is with our Race at Work Charter. So this launched in 2018 with 85 employers. We now have more than 600, and they affect more than 5 million employees. What we are asking employers to do when they sign up to that charter is commit to have somebody at the top table who's responsible to ensure that this stays on the agenda, that it's looked at, that the data is monitored, and all the things that I've suggested are implemented. The second commitment is about data and having transparency around that, not only capturing it, but publicizing progress. And as part of that, we are actively campaigning for the consultation that was opened in 2018 and closed in 2019 on ethnicity pay gap reporting to be implemented. We know it's not a silver bullet. We know it has complexities attached to it, but actually it does keep this issue on the top table, which is where it needs to remain, and ensure that it gets the focus and attention that it needs from senior leaders. The other thing we offer, and then the third commitment is zero tolerance on bullying harassment. So, it's one thing getting people in the door, but you want them to feel like they belong, feel like this is a safe place. So we're really encouraging employers to implement policy, not only to ensure that they work in an environment among their teams that is free of bullying harassment, but also engagement with customers and clients. And then the fourth area is managers promoting equality, because we know they're often the gateway to opportunities inside the workplace. So we actively want them to have objectives, to care about this, and this be part of their performance and reward as being a good leader. And then the fifth area is to progress talent for all the reasons we've already set out before. When you think about the challenges of higher housing costs, etc., and the drive is there, because every year, every time we run the survey, we ask, do you want to progress? 70% of the respondents from ethnically diverse backgrounds say yes, they really want to progress. So the drive is there, and they're prepared to fast track. We're going to drop a couple of other things that we're working on, that happy to continue more when we have the Q&A, is a levy sharing. So we are, with Co-op and other organisations, looking to encourage employers, rather than to give their unspent levy back to the government, to actually donate it or put it into this, what we're calling a circle of opportunity. And what we would like to do with that levy is create apprenticeship opportunities that will enable those who are ethnic minority background, lower socioeconomic background, all the different challenges that stop you getting an apprenticeship opportunity, to be able to get one. Interestingly, I've already seen some potential barriers, and Omar talks about these structural barriers. When I think about how can an Asian or Black-led business who may not have all the investment and the steady kind of cash flow that is required to take on an apprenticeship, be part of that opportunity. So I'm flagging that already with our leadership team in the next few weeks, to say, I see a barrier here. What are we going to do? Because I believe we could really actually stimulate the labour market in a significant way if businesses from all backgrounds, no matter what their status, were able to take on and create some of these apprenticeship opportunities. I'm going to stop there because I want to give time for question and answers. And I suppose the one last thing I would say, we're really encouraging private sector organisations to take the equality impact assessment approach when they make decisions. Do not just cut swathes of your workforce without monitoring the impact of what it will do to your ethnic minority workers or gender, because of the certain occupation strands or business strands that you decide to cut. So we're really encouraging employers, think first, run the assessment, look at the data, and in its simplest form, you shouldn't have 30% of people in your furlough pool from an ethnic minority background if you only have 10% in your workforce. It should be more aligned to what your workplace representation is. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Sandra. That was excellent. Good to hear the perspective from the business side of things as well. And I'm sure there's topics in that people will want to ask questions about. Omar and Andrea have joined us again, and I want to pick up in a second some of the themes that we heard during their presentations. I mean, it's very interesting. Three quite different focuses, I think, but some commonalities across the three, and I think there are some common themes that we can explore and try and push a little further. Before I do that, can I just remind you that if you do want to ask any questions, please type them into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. I think I said the chat box earlier. I have been corrected, and it's the Q&A box. So please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try and get onto as many of those as we can a bit later in this session. First up, though, I mean, I wanted to pick up something that Omar touched on there, and it's about this kind of how we kind of frame some of these discussions. And it's kind of, if I was to put it slightly bluntly, I'd say, are we a little bit squeamish about calling this racism and discrimination? We talk an awful lot about inequality and disadvantage and diversity and that sort of thing. And I think Omar was making the point there about maybe the need to be a little more pointed in the discussion of this as discrimination, and to be clear about the fact that that racism exists in these institutions and needs to be called out and confronted more directly. From your perspectives, is that something that you think is important, or do you think there are risks down that route? And Sandra, maybe if I could come to you first on that.
I mean, I think for me, I think the challenges, so what we're working with employers is to be informed by the data, and part of why I'm so keen to surface what the challenge is, so that when they look at those who are recruiting, when they're looking at planning to recruit, when they're looking at their talent pipelines, they're aware of what the labour market should look like. So we want them to be informed. And I think my biggest challenge, what I'm working on now, is really mobilising the employers who are coming in daily, signing up to the Race at Work Charter, to actually, by giving them information, by helping them with how do you set targets to understand what your local labour market looks like, who should be coming through your doors, thinking about the pre-application orientation to your sector, particularly where there's huge, lots of underrepresentation. How are people going to be informed about what your sector does? So don't just say, oh, they don't come and apply to us. Actually, sometimes there's a lack of awareness because there isn't the representation within your sector. So really encouraging employers to be proactive. I think there's an appetite, well, I know within our network, to want to do something. But I can already see that some of the barriers that exist may become a challenge. So one of the other things that I'm really asking for now is when the ONS data starts coming out on what's happening with the census, we need live, up-to-date data. What does the labour market look like, so that employers can be informed and take the necessary action that they need to be taking.
Thanks, Sandra. I mean, just picking up on that a little bit more. I mean, you mentioned data and being driven by the data. Do you think that firms have enough data? Do they have the incentive to collect that data? Is that a potential role for policy and actually, mandating that, enforcing that collection of data? I know there's been a discussion around pay gap reporting. Is that something that's a way forward? And I mean, there's a further point around that, I guess, which is that we might expect that the larger companies, the well-known companies, the ones that sit on your board and so on, would find that both easier, but also perhaps the most detrimental if they weren't seen to be doing something in this space. But of course, most employees don't work in those kinds of companies. So is there an issue about reaching out to some of the smaller companies as well?
I mean, I think absolutely. I think there's an opportunity for the larger ones to support all the employees in their supply chain and extended supply chain. And also, I think surely with technology, there must be some software that we can create that will enable some of this to be done more easily, to be able to be analysed. One of the challenges that people throw out is too difficult, but the pandemic is difficult. Has that stopped policy being made? Have we just said not to bother to work on it? So I think there is, I think it's important because, what I know people think, oh, but everybody understands that we need to take action. Well, I think, what I find is that you always still have to make the case, the why, the evidence. And I say data, but not just that, the stories, the people's lived experience that go with that. So they realize behind that are individuals with families, lives and things. So some of the things that Andrea brought out in her presentation, these are people with real lives and not taking action. There is a knock-on effect and impact for people. And the other part is telling the story about what you should really look like as far as representation, if you were as fair as everybody wants to be, and what you do look like. And again, really encouraging that people change those percentages to numbers as to what it should look like in the number of real people included in the workplace.
Thanks, Sandra. Andrea, did you want to come in on the point about racism, discrimination, and how we sort of frame this conversation?
Yeah, and I'd also like to come in on the data point after. But first, I would think, JRF has been doing work, we do work on framing and how we frame a discussion, say, on poverty or inequality, so that, you don't close ears, you open ears and you open hearts, and you get people to understand what you mean. And for that, we've also started to do, we're funding some work with for Runnymede Trust. They were doing some work on reframing race and reframing the discussion around race again, so we can kind of start getting through to people to understand what we mean when we talk about race and ethnicity. There's one report already out on this, and there will be more reports coming forward. And so I guess from us, we also recognize the idea that, when sometimes I have to say BAME, I really want to be able to say Black, or I really want to be able to say Indian or Pakistani. And I want to say the ethnicity, the group of people I'm talking about, but getting towards data, that sometimes the data does not allow me to do that because I have to aggregate, groups so that I can have enough observations to do analysis. And there's that point as well of, if we want to talk about ethnicity and race in these groups correctly, then we also need the data to follow to allow us to do that. So JRF, we always are asking, what our deputy director is currently, his ask is that the government also would evaluate how they could present the data that they, the ONS, DWP, in disaggregated ethnic groups, and to take those steps wherever possible. This could possibly mean a methodology change, but also could mean increasing your sample size. So that could be a huge factor, just increase the sample size so I can look at Indian versus Pakistanis. Because you could see before in my graphs, there are distinct differences between ethnic minority groups, and not only just groups, but men and women in age groups and region. So in order for us to be able to do that work and provide that evidence, we need the data to follow. And we think there is a big role that the government can play, because a lot of the data I use is from the government, and it's government collected data to make sure we can do the work. But I will also say that employers do have a role. Employers do have a role to ensure the data that they're presenting about their own workplace is as sufficient as possible, so we can understand what's going on and we can just make it better. We're not trying to make it worse for them, but better.
Thanks, Andrea. That's maybe a good juncture to actually put in a little commercial break for our Evens survey, which was mentioned at the start by Bridget, and that is very much an attempt to get more data and to go out there and I think we're looking for 17,000 respondents. So I think I would encourage anyone who's watching this event either live or on the recording to seek that out. I think there will be a link in the chat box later and a slide at the end, and please complete that survey. It's a very important survey for all the reasons that Andrea's just mentioned. So kind of exploring that point and sort of going into developing it a little bit. I think, Omar, you raised this point about the sort of discrimination and racism, and I was going to come back to you and mention Anthony Heath's paper on this, where he compares the work that you spoke about, which is about the CVs, the number of CVs that different groups have to submit in order to get a callback from job interviews. He compares that with sort of labour force survey data, and my reading of what he says there is that it seems to be that the level of discrimination at that sifting stage is roughly the same for groups like Indians and Chinese and Pakistani and Black Caribbeans, but actually the employment rates of those groups are actually quite different, with the Indian and the Chinese groups comparing favourably with those others. And so that leads to speculation about what else is going on there, and there's some speculation in Anthony's paper, which I don't think they reach a very firm conclusion on that. But I guess, the broader point, I guess, is that in some of the slides that Andrea put up, some of the slides I put up, we do see these big differences between different groups on various different labour market outcomes. Andrea's just referred to that in what she said there. To what extent do you think that dilutes the kind of message that goes out there about this whole area and about ethnic minority disadvantage? We talk about ethnic minority disadvantage. It's in the title of tonight's talk, I think. So what's the sort of how do we kind of confront that, and does it sort of, do you think that message gets out enough to people, Omar?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good challenge as well. I think it's a real, I think the work that JRF are funding for Runnymede in terms of messaging is really crucial here. Clearly, one of the additional factors is the different sort of class or educational background of those different groups and the different wealth positions. So I think there's a question in the chat around this, but the average Indian household has 95p on the average pound of white British wealth, and the average Bangladeshi household is 10p on the pound. So obviously, those wealth disparities are very significant, and so even if race discrimination was a factor. The other factors come into play in terms of other inequalities in society, right? But so I think there's that, first of all, right? So that the different position of different groups will obviously mean that the effect of racial discrimination as an independent factor will vary. But I think the other point is there are different stereotypes about different ethnic and racial groups, about Black women versus Black men. And so the way in which that operates is as well is likely to have real effects in the labor market, right? So that it might be the case that, yeah, I mean, this is a very kind of crude way of thinking about it, but there's been sort of some studies that suggest that whereas Chinese and Indian men, for example, might be employers might be very happy to hire them as senior IT technicians, they don't see them as leaders in the organization, but that means they have higher salaries, as at least getting employed, whereas Black men aren't seen as being having those qualifications or qualities, right? So that the different kinds of ways in which those stereotypes operate result in different. So they're all potentially facing racial discrimination in the labor market, but both because of their prior economic or class position and because of the way in which different ethnic and racial stereotypes operate, the outcome is different, right? And I think it's very obvious in criminal justice, right? So I think it would be very wrong-headed, inaccurate to suggest that all ethnic minorities face the same kinds of inequalities in the criminal justice system. Black men obviously face specific inequalities, and that's because of the specific stereotype about Black men as violent and threatening, which has a long history in enslavement and in all sorts of other histories in the UK and in around the world. So yeah, I guess I think that the point really for me though is not that racial discrimination explains everything either, right? So I think my concern in making that claim is more that I worry that racial discrimination is erased completely as an explanatory variable, right? So it gets sort of explained away. And I think the final 2 points on this is, there is a challenge, the fact that the data are so complex, right? And it is true that different groups experience different forms of discrimination. And I think that the challenge is both communicating publicly that racism still is a phenomenon in our society when you're caveating it and explaining it in so many different ways. But I think it's also a challenge in terms of policy, right? So if you were saying we need to tackle these inequalities, well, actually, these inequalities look so different that the policies need to be so specified for particular groups. Is that what we're really saying? But the flip side is if we don't specify them, if we have just a generic kind of policy that affects all ethnic minorities, won't that benefit those ethnic minority groups that are experiencing the least discrimination or the closest to getting, salariat jobs? And I think you see that even with, for example, the civil service fast stream, which is now has roughly an equivalent number of ethnic minorities in it. But when you look at the number of Black, Bangladeshi and Pakistani people who get through that fast stream, it's very few. And that sort of speaks to the slides that Andrea highlighted and the evidence that Sandra said. So so it's a challenge not just in terms of analysis, but in terms of policy. And I think finally, in terms of mobilization, I think people are talking, I think there is a question there around communities. I mean, I think the other challenge there is all of the groups. One of the ways that social change in this area is going to happen is by the communities that are affected mobilizing and organizing in civil society. But when the experiences are so different, it becomes a challenge to bring them together under a shared umbrella. And that weakens the power of the ethnic minority voice politically. So there's a kind of, I think there's a civil society challenge there as well. And I understand why groups might say, that the leadership of that organization doesn't suggest that they understand the specific forms of racism that we experience as a group.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I want to come on to policy, and I think there is all three of your organisations are very much in the business of speaking to policymakers and trying to inform that. And I think some of the points you raised, Omar, there about should we have specific policies for specific groups? I think those are really important. And I think where a lot of policy has kind of reached a stumbling block, I think the people are again wary of going down certain routes there about being seen to to have favourite groups, as it were. So I think that's important, and I think there's a wider question about what works in this space. So there's a lot of research, as we were saying at the start, many years worth of research, but there's a bit of an implementation gap, it would seem, in terms of actually getting from that research to stuff that works out there in the real world. So I'd kind of like to address those, but I do want to get onto some of the questions, because some of the audience have been putting questions into the Q&A box. Please continue to do that if you've got any other questions. So there's a question from Hannah, which is about wealth, which again, Omar, you kind of addressed that, but Hannah's question is, what can policy do to promote wealth accumulation among people of colour in the UK? So Andrea and then Sandra, would you like to sort of pick that up?
So from, it's important to distinguish between what we mean by wealth. So I'm going to relate wealth when talking about like housing, so assets. So, and part of that, Omar, which Omar, it's kind of already have alluded to, is, certain groups are more likely as well to own their own home. And that aspect of asset wealth accumulation is really important, especially when you think of where most, say, for example, Black households live. They're more likely to live in a very high cost housing area, but really high housing prices. So you think of a group of, say, Black African or Black Caribbean families living in London, they, a large part of their wealth will be considered in their assets, and that asset would be a home. And from what we know in the data, again, from Runnymede Trust, is the average amount of, the average percentage of Black households who actually own their home is actually relatively low, especially when you consider some of these groups, again, it's been alluded to, the differences between groups can be also broken down by even immigration laws and immigration practices, which allowed people to come to the country. And so when you compare Black Africans with Black Caribbeans and, say, Indian or Pakistani, you see distinct differences, even though they have very different immigration rules that allow them to come to the country. And so Black Caribbean and Africans are less likely to own their home, and again, have very low asset wealth. So when we're talking about accumulation within the community, we also must, again, it's housing. It's the ability to own your own home, and that is an immediate effect in building wealth.
I was on mute, apologies. Thanks, Andrea, I said. Sandra, would you like to come in there on the wealth?
Yeah, I mean, I can only, even talk from my own experience. And, so I had written here, without generational wealth. So you don't have, assets passed down that you're going to get to start. The biggest challenge is to get home ownership. My parents came over with Windrush, at the end of the Windrush policies, and how I ended up getting, and we were raised in a housing estate, how I ended up getting the first place that I owned, it was because they had rented for so long that, and I know this is political, and people go, but it was the right to buy scheme that through they had that, and because I was living with them, I was also eligible. And I remember in those days, both my husband and I, the income together was so low, we couldn't even get a mortgage in the normal way. So we know there's tensions with that, because we say we need low-cost housings, but I think people who have been renting for years need to be given the opportunity to part, purchase, and then continue, because how do you start otherwise? And now, because things since the crash, borrowing just, you need a kind of a huge deposit to even get started. I think some of those things have got to be tackled alongside proper pay, routes to progression, people who are in enterprise being able to get good funding streams and stable funding streams so they can kind of, grow and how many great innovative ideas are on the cutting room floor because you can't get the funding, you can't get the steps towards the backers, you don't know the backers. So I think there are a number of routes into wealth. And also I think if we could ever stimulate the market and enable Black and Asian-led businesses to grow, many of them would employ Black and Asian people. So that would help some of the unemployment challenges as well. But yeah, so as far as, I think the biggest one is actually owning assets, and one of the big ones is housing. But as I say, to get on that ladder from a housing estate, and which I don't know how I would have done it otherwise if there wasn't that opportunity to get a discount, because my parents had paid so many years. They probably bought that, their property many years over, but they were also giving discounts to children of people from those, and that's how I got mine. And I haven't given this one enough thought to think of other ways, because I can't really think of anything else really other than helping people with their housing costs, get them down so they can, stop paying one day.
Thank you. So we've got a question which is about the particular poverty faced by Black people with disabilities and impaired health and the impact on employment. So could the panelists speak to the particular poverty faced by Black people with disabilities and impaired health and the impact on employment? Andrea, is that something that you can take?
Yeah, I can. That's a really, definitely a very specific question. I can talk about certain aspects of it separately and say what it would look like if interaction. Unless there's someone else who has something else I'd like to say before I do that. No? Go? Right. Great. So we do know, so when we think about disability, we do know that people who are disabled are more likely to live in poverty. We do know that because they face higher costs overall, being disabled face higher costs. That's why they get a disability payment, but we know that does not go far enough to cover the true cost of living with a disability. We also know there are other aspects of being disabled and the effect that would have on employment. We must also acknowledge that recently there has been a drop in unemployment for disabled workers, but it has also corresponded with an increase in economic inactive workers who are disabled. So when we think about Black workers who are disabled, I think that would be a compounding effect. So one thing when we think about COVID, when we think about, the initial COVID, people were able to work from home. Previously, people who were disabled were told they could not work from home because they couldn't make the alterations needed for people to work from home. However, we've seen that is possible and we can do that, and it's up to employers to start doing that themselves. But also we saw at the beginning, people who are disabled more likely to be told to shield, or actually, unfortunately, we've seen they were more likely to be made redundant rather than furloughed at the beginning of COVID. One aspect that we need to consider, and this gets a bit more into ethnicity, is the idea of long-term COVID. And is that the next form of a hidden disability that people don't fully understand, and that could impact certain ethnic groups more than others because of the higher rates of infection of COVID in certain groups. But so again, when we think about employment and disability, there are key barriers to even entering the market, the labor market. And it means you see an overrepresentation of disabled workers in self-employment, which I am assuming you're going to see that especially in Black disabled workers, Black men, and even Black women. And also you see them less likely to be in the occupations that would allow them to earn enough to get out of in-work poverty. So they're more likely to be in what I don't want to call lower class occupation, but just not like managers, they call elementary type occupations. So I think that's all I would actually say on that, because I don't know loads, unfortunately, on disabled men with a disability in work. But those would be the other, factors of being a disabled worker. And again, the factor of being a Black man in a labor market that is not always going to treat you too kindly anyway.
Thanks, Andrea. That was a very full answer, I think, to the question. So thank you for that. I think there's a question from Rebecca, and maybe this is one that Sandra could look at first. It's usually the higher up the organisation you go, the whiter it gets. What work are you involved in that specifically addresses racial discrimination in leadership, recruitment, and at board levels, including youth trustees? So that's the question. It's about improving diversity at leadership level and at board level, I guess.
No, so good. Thanks for the question. The employers that we work with on the Race at Work Charter, we do encourage them to look at succession planning. Who gets the opportunities? How are they building that diversity into talent pipelines? How are they populating the teams that feed into the top table? So, finance teams, marketing teams, wherever they have kind of board places, how are they actually ensuring that people are in those teams so that they're in line for those roles? How are they ensuring, and one of the things I talked about with the charter, And we do an annual survey with employers, and what we find actually is senior leaders are more likely to have a performance objective, some which links to their financial reward, to be inclusive, to set targets, to kind of pipeline talent, but managers don't. So I'm saying there's a huge challenge really for this to be important to managers, to not be seen as an add-on rather than critical for the organization. So we do actively in our conversations about the fifth commitment, progressing talent. And I have to say, every time we have an event and we say to employers, what is the most important area, or what would you like more help on? The fifth one, which is progressing talent, is a big one, because they know there's the retention challenge. When we surveyed last time, 52% of ethnic minority people said that they actually feel like they need to leave their employer to progress. So they know if they're not creating opportunities, not being transparent to show that there is a way up, for example, they risk losing that talent. So we do talk to them about talent pipeline as part of the commitment to the charter.
Thank you, Sandra. Omar, it strikes me this is also an issue for higher education and seniority in higher education and sort of rising up the ranks there. Is that something that you're concerned about, either within your organization or more generally?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mentioned it in my presentation that there's a kind of vicious circle, I think, even in terms of the proportion you get first and 2-1s, and then the proportion who end up being lecturers, but even then the proportion who stay in academia. I mean, at one point when I was director of Runnymede, I think we employed 5 ethnic minorities with PhDs, which was probably more than any university department was employing at the time, and we only employed like 10 people. So I think it's quite striking how many don't fall through. So I think there's a real issue still in academia, and there's going to have to be. I think one of the things that's good about this question, and I think Sandra's response is, there is a sort of view sometimes that we've just realized that we have a problem of representation, right? Because the young population, look, it's 20% BME, and there's lots of graduates, and there's so much talent and opportunity. But the reality is, middle management and people in their 50s and 60s, we should be seeing much more ethnic minorities. So, for example, in London, 40% of those aged 45 to 54 are BME. It's not just a phenomenon of 20 to 25-year-olds. In fact, 25% of those aged over 65 in London, aged around 65, are BME. So you would expect, that those are, the median age of a FTSE 100 board member is 59, and most FTSE 100 companies in Britain are based in London. So, and yet they're struggling to find even one board member for their boards out of 10 or 12. So I think the reality is, if you're an organization that's focusing only on the hiring and sifting problem, like trying to get your graduate recruitment right, that's not going to be good enough. You need to focus on your progression issues, as Sandra says. And I think thinking really serious about middle management and seniority. And I also agree with Sandra. I mean, one of the things I've said in the past publicly is that one way to try to improve the BAME graduate degree awarding gap would be to incentivize vice chancellors and people at that team that you wouldn't get a pay rise yourself unless you saw that gap closing. If you made that a metric, I think you'd start to see, and I think that's a more general point. You make it the business. It's great to appeal to people's moral attitudes or their beliefs about the badness of discrimination. It's also useful, I think, to think about what other levers we could use to incentivize people to act. And I think one of them is to make it, as Sandra said, a sort of KPI or an objective. I think if you're not very good at progressing your ethnic minority staff in Britain's cities today, you're just not a very good manager, objectively speaking. And so you shouldn't yourself get a good year's appraisal, and you shouldn't yourself get a pay rise. And I think if you started implementing policies like that, you'd see some of these gaps narrow more quickly.
Thanks. That does lead me kind of back to policy, because I was the kinds of things you're talking about there, Omar. I mean, some companies do that. I remember reading a survey of I think it was the top 100 employers in the UK, and they were asked an open-ended question about what was on their mind at the current time. And I think the single biggest concern was meeting diversity targets, and that was actually what they just kind of identified as being the thing that was concerning them. So, you know, that in a sense, there's been some kind of increased focus on the diversity of the workforce in these private sector, actually some public sector too, organisations. And that, as I said before, my worry maybe is about the small and medium enterprises, or, you know, further down the distribution of firms where there are perhaps less inroads being made on that front. But it leads me to a question, which is, there are organizations and institutions in society which are taking a lead and doing such things, and, you know, and you're trying to nudge universities down the road, and the Office for Students is nudging universities as well, and actually is not fining vice chancellors directly, but at least threatening universities with consequences if they don't meet attainment gap or awarding gap targets. And I guess my question is, how far can civil society institutions go without leadership from the government, and what's the sort of balance between what we, inverted commas, we can do, and where we need government leadership? And Sandra, I don't know, do you want to comment on that?
I think so. One of the things, and as I say, I know it's not a silver bullet. I know it can't fix everything, but ethnicity pay gap reporting. So when we look at gender pay gap reporting, this time they said you don't have to do it. And what was it, a third? I mean, many just didn't bother. So that tells you that government leadership on things matter. We had 30 chief execs sign an open letter to the Prime Minister saying, can you implement ethnicity pay gap reporting? I mean, hello, asking to be regulated the same, please implement it. And what we're seeing is employers are just starting to publish anyway. But as I say, what we've learned from gender pay gap reporting, that you do need government leadership to make sure that all employers take action and comply. So I think leadership from that top table is really important. And also, you would almost wonder, don't you want to tackle these systemic barriers? Don't you want to tackle these long-standing unemployment gaps and things like that? And another thing, for example, we've been encouraging employers, government to do, and I think, you know, they've done it in a softer way, but actually really asking about contracts. What are you doing on race? Those who are going to be using taxpayers' money need to be helping with the labour market challenges. So I think we do need government to act on some of those kind of big levers that need to be pulled to make change.
Andrea, can I bring you in on that? I mean, I guess the same question about the balance between other institutions and government, but also, I mean, as JRF, you've got experience of lobbying government and you know, trying to influence change through that way. What kind of works do you think? What's the best way of getting there, of getting the attention of government and getting them to actually do things?
So I think from JRF's focus, we would say that one of the biggest levers they can do is their own procurement, which I think, you know, Sandra just discussed. It's just that level that, you know, contractors, anyone working with the government must have certain things in place. When I was in my previous employer, that's something they also were looking at themselves just internally. How do we use our procurement contracts as a local government organization to implement our own change? And that was related to North-South divide. That wasn't even looking at ethnicity, and it was largely successful. It was a really successful way of doing it. That would be one thing. But JRF's focus has also just been, it's been the way we do policy campaigns, the way we do campaigns to government is such an interesting approach. I was trying to explain it to my husband, and we don't just look at not only just the government and the parties who's in power, it's the other parties who are involved. It's the cross-party committees. It's more than just let's just go straight to number 10. We create pressure around government so that they have no choice but to act. And that's the way we try to implement change. So, you know, the universal credit, £20 uplift, keep the lifeline, is creating that pressure, and not only just pressure around, you know, in Westminster, but all over the country, so that people feel that, you know, it's pushing the government to do something. It's largely successful. If you look at the Marcus Rashford campaign when it came to school meals, is creating that outside pressure so that they had no choice, they felt it. And that's what JRF's focus really is when we do campaigns. If I can just briefly say that the inequality, the pay, the ethnicity inequality is also a factor in the charity sector, and it's really, really important to address that and to say that, you know, as a charity, as a social justice organization, we are not immune to these differing outcomes when it comes to diversity and inclusion within our own organizations. There's been very public showings of this over the last year of organizations, especially after Black Lives Matter, realizing that they are not equipped necessarily to address this, and the emergence of Charity So White really bringing it to the core of just how, unfortunately, white and middle class presenting and London focused the charity sector can be, and how detrimental it can be on the groups that we're trying to help. So I just wanted to put that in and almost to say it's not just you guys, it's us too. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I laughed there when you said Marcus Rashford, because just going through my head was, yeah, the way to do it is to get him interested in it, isn't it? That's how you do it. We're running out of time. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. Could I maybe just, if you've got a 30-second thing you want to say, you're very welcome to say that now. Omar, no?
No, just thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's great to be back in touch with Code and to see both Sandra and Andrea in my new role. It's good to reconnect with you, and thank you to the audience for listening to us and for your questions. Great, thanks, Omar. Sandra, Andrea?
Yeah, it's not like me to not have anything to say, but as I say, I'm just saying that, you know, I'm not going away. We're opening the survey on race up in the workplace, looking at race at work on the 22nd of March, and we want people to fill it out and tell us their stories so that we can continue to apply some of that pressure that Andrew just talked about. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. And we're happy to plug your survey as well. Andrea?
Just the normal spiel at the end of any Joseph Rowntree Foundation contribution is, again, we can solve UK poverty. When discussing employment in young people, it is a direct link to poverty in the UK and the structural inequalities we find in the labor market, in housing and social security. And again, there's an ability to solve it and get rid of it, because the UK should not be with poverty, and we shouldn't have these inequalities in employment, in housing, et cetera, for our young ethnic groups. It's simply unacceptable. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you all. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you all very, very much indeed. It's been a really good discussion. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much to the audience for their participation and their questions. I think what's going to happen now is there's going to appear a slide which has got the details of the Even survey on it, the survey that we've mentioned. So please have a look at that and think about filling it in and contributing to our research. Otherwise, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.